My name is Scott Wayne. I am a negotiator, moderator, and facilitator, and we spend our days studying human decision making. We look at the irrational choices that human beings make, and we support our clients in building programs that shift those behaviors. What I wanted to say first of all is thank you all for joining us, but mainly thank you for the responsibility that you've taken on your shoulders over these past few months. Having served in a national government, I've never served in state governments, but I understand how government works, and I presume that state governments in the United States are no different from the national government of the United Kingdom or the European Union, which is the politicians make policy and then the civil service execute that policy. And the decisions that you all make in terms of prioritization and resource allocation really affect the citizens in the front line around whether something happens. You know, there was a joke in the British government that decisions would be made in Downing Street, and then whether those decisions were executed or not were decided in the Red Lion pub across the street in Whitehall as the civil service decided what they would prioritize and not. And so I just want to say thank you for the weight that you have all carried at various levels of state and Commonwealth governments on behalf of those of us who are citizens and those of us who are not citizens but are here resident and experiencing this both economic and health crisis that we're going through. On that note, we have various talks that we give around negotiation, and there are tools and techniques to influence others, and that's typically what people are interested in. But if you'd allow me, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about how we negotiate with ourselves during this period of change. And I know that might seem a very strange concept to you, but there's two aspects to a negotiation. There is the other and ourself. And for us to be effective in empathizing and understanding the perspective of the other, we have to be grounded in ourselves. And during these periods of time, we can become untethered and somewhat lost. And so if you'll allow me, I would like to talk about how we engage with ourselves during this time. One way to think about this is the phrase negotiating with, and you hear it in sports sometimes, very technical and risk-based sports. So you'll hear about extreme climbers, they're negotiating with a rock face, or they're negotiating with a climb, or you'll hear about extreme skiers who are negotiating with a ski run. And of course, they're not actually talking to that ski run or that mountain face. They're negotiating between it, the challenge, and themselves, whether they will find a way to work through this or not. And I feel that this is what we're facing now. So let me just say this to you. We are all right now, including the most powerful chief administrators, in one of the 5 stages of grief. We are in denial, we're in anger, we're bargaining, we're in depression, or we're in a state of acceptance. The world has been ripped from us, the world that we knew. And I think you're probably seeing your citizens and residents at various stages themselves, which is explaining their behaviors. And so we're all grieving at this moment. We're all making deeply irrational decisions, largely based upon what phase we're in and accepting that this is our new reality, probably for some time to come. And so I'd just like us to embrace that we are all in this space where the quality of decisions we were making 6 months ago are probably degraded somewhat. The other thing we're facing with today is through social media and our interactions with it, is that we have a society that's questioning what is real. We have algorithms that are constantly self-reinforcing our own views. And so we don't have a common base from which to approach problems and communicate to each other. This represents an enormous challenge for those of us who are trying to create a baseline and find cohesion for a path forward. And so let me just sort of share that as a perspective. So how do we ground ourselves? Well, we have a very simple process for doing that. And for those who are very logical amongst you, be pleased to know that it's based upon a spreadsheet. Now, I'm going to tell you how to do this. We take our executive clients and government leaders through this process. Let me just share my screen for one moment. And I would like to say, while we have this opportunity, that everybody who wants to be in this session is now in this session. I'm sorry for that slight delay in being able to bring people through. Okay, here we go. So we call this our life grid, and the goal of this is to be able to ground ourselves as negotiators, and it works very simple. It's a 4-column model. You can put this in your favorite spreadsheet software, And you can list any category you wish to the left, and then you define okay, good, and great. I'm going to give you an example. So if I were to list income, job, the schools that my kids go to, healthcare that we have, time that we get alone, then I would define in those boxes what is okay, good, and great for myself. And this is a document that you essentially negotiate with yourself over. You spend time really reflecting, who am I and what is it that I want? So you define what is acceptable to you, what is good, what is great. You decide the categories, and then you highlight where you currently are. Now, this is really important. By writing this down, what we're doing is we're telling ourselves what it is that we want in life. And as you're dealing with this enormous change out in externalities, you're constantly referencing this document to say, how do I move next to move myself progressively from left to right? That these shaded boxes are moving from acceptable to great. And the measure of success, this is really important, is not whether we have everything that we want, but whether these boxes are moving from left to right. And as you're all dealing with economic challenges and changes in how we live, this will help you anchor yourself in your reality about who you are and what you want. And this is critically important if we're going to influence others who are going through a great deal of change, because what we have to start doing to influence others is to disenthrall ourselves from ourselves. We have to be able to put all our energies to be able to empathize with our key stakeholders, whether that's your governors, whether that's your mayors, or that's your citizenry. We need to empathize. And just to be clear, not sympathize. Sympathize comes from the phrase simpatico. It means how I would feel if I were in your shoes. So we express sympathy at a death of a relative, of a friend, because if I experienced the same thing, I would feel the same way. Empathy is, how would I feel if I were you in this role? How would I feel if I were you in this situation? Your gender, your sexual orientation, your faith, your ethnicity, your age, your education, your cultural background. And we should be able to empathize with people who are entirely unlike ourselves, because it's only through that we can build a relationship and speak to people in a means that they can recognize and relate to. And I hope at this point, everybody is thinking around those scenarios where you've had enormous misconnects because both parties haven't been able to empathize with one another. So I'm going to now take us through, we've grounded ourselves in what it is, who we are and what we want. We're disenthralling ourselves from ourselves, and we're putting all of our energies on focusing on stakeholders that we need to influence and negotiate with during this period. So there are three keys to this. They're very simple. The first is to identify motive. The second is to move from positions to interest. And the third is around how we frame issues. And I'm going to move quickly through this process, but we will be making a raft of materials available on the NASCA website for you to have available to you. I'm going to start with a quick question and answer. I'm going to ask you to do this in the Zoom chat. For the next 3 minutes, you get to ask me any question you want. And the goal of this is for you to identify what motivates me in life. And I promise to answer truthfully, and you don't need to be politically correct. But we're going to try to identify my survival motivation, what it is that I define as needing to survive, and my identity motivation. That is presuming I have my needs met, how I see myself, okay? So it's not how I actually am, but it's how I see myself. One way to think of it is the Instagram version of myself. So for the next 3 minutes, I just want you to put questions into this chat room of, what do you want to ask me to try to identify what motivates myself? And I'm going to make this available to the NASCA team. You get to ask me anything you want. I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, there we go. Oh, here they come. Let me move this chat box so I can read it. Why do I do the work that I do? Because I'm fascinated around the crazy decisions that people make and what leads them to do it. And I get quite an ego kick out of finding a path to lead them to do something differently. My family, growing up, I grew up in the north of England in a post-industrial town called Teesside. And my dad was an oil rigger, and my uncles and aunts all worked in shipyards. Let's see. What was my family like? Very, very warm and close and supportive. What I like to do outdoors, I love to kayak and I love to trail run. I hate road running, but I love to trail run. Definitely dogs, not cats. What do I want my life to look like in 5 years? Actually very similar to right now. I work 5 minutes from my office. we get to work on interesting projects like this. I'd just like to keep it right here. Achievement most proud of? This makes me uncomfortable because I do that fake humble thing that you see a lot of people in my role do, where I pretend to be humble, but I'm not really. I've got a huge ego. Probably the pivot that we've done from doing a lot of in-person facilitation to building a digital studio to be able to do this thing. If we survive COVID, that will be my greatest achievement. Where do I want to travel once where we are allowed to? I'm not sure. Where do I want to travel? I'm not sure what that question is. Where would I like to go travel most? Actually, I don't believe in bucket lists. I think bucket lists are a terrible idea. The idea that you can go to Paris and see the Eiffel Tower and you've checked off your bucket list, but you may never have really interacted with a French family. I think we should have experience bucket lists, that I want to have a debate with somebody I disagree with passionately over a great bottle of red wine, but you're not worried about where it is or whether you got a photograph of it. What's my best 5K trail run? There's one right across the street by the James River, and it's a combined mountain path trail and hiking trail. But we also, at this time of year, we have a lot of snakes. So the way that I'm able to run is I'm focused on not tripping over and not getting bitten by a snake, and that takes the pain away. How do I want people to perceive me? As a great dad, as a really good dad. I've got 3 kids from 2 moms, and I'm divorced, and it pains me that they have such a disruptive family life, and so I just want to be a great dad. I've got to do where do my kids go to school? It's a great question. I live in the city, but they go to private school. Actually, 2 of the 3 go to private school. So I'm that horrendous person that wants to live in the city, but don't send my kids to private school. Do I get questions about your accent, or are people fascinated by it? Yes. Australians presume that I'm an idiot, and Americans think that I'm smarter than I am because of the British accent. Okay. I think that's probably good. Have I ever hiked a 14? And no, I haven't done a 14,000 footer. I'm not that fit. Okay, so based upon all of that, what you start to get a picture of is my survival and identity. Oh, we're just going to mute a couple of people here. There we go. Great. Thank you. So you get a picture of what drives me. Okay, what's my survival motive? It's my kids. It's making sure that they have decent schooling. Now, if that's at risk, if during this economic recession that's at risk, I'm going to make some really irrational decisions about how I make choices. Once my survival motive is covered, you know that I live in Richmond, Virginia. The cost of living here is pretty low. So it's really private schooling that's my main cost. Once that's covered, we all shift to identity. And it's clear that I have a large ego. I like being involved in tough decisions. I like dealing with senior people. I'm intrigued by all of that stuff. What doesn't come across is I don't really talk about money, and I don't really talk about things that much. So in reading me, what you understand is that I'm not really an entrepreneur at all. I'm really interested in how things work. And so my motivation is this door. This was a door that I walked by in Amsterdam last year with our producer, Claire O'Keefe, and it drove me crazy because it simply said behind the scenes. And I desperately wanted to get behind this door to see behind the scenes. And of course, all it is a janitor's closet where they've decided to put behind the scenes instead of the janitor's closet. But it illustrates what drives me. And so but if you did a demographic survey of me, I'm a white male in my mid-40s that runs his own business, I'd land in this sort of entrepreneur bracket. And they'd say I was motivated by sort of frequent flyer status or money and all of those things. And that's not it at all. And so we'd miss. And so it's really important that when we're dealing with stakeholders, whether it's your coworkers or the people you report to, is for us to be empathizing and sitting in the shoes of them, because it's that identity thing that will motivate how we make decisions. And sometimes there can be enormous blowback to these if we get it wrong. Let me illustrate this through a Father's Day card that my mother sent to me. So she sent me this card right in the middle of the divorce. I'm very focused on kids. And she sent me this card, which you can read there. Hi, Dad, you're the very best dad in the world, and we love you so, so much. With love from your girls, and a photograph of me and my kids. So you think that was right on, right? Understanding my motivations in life. There's one slight problem with this, is that photograph isn't of me and my kids, it's of my brother and my kids, with my mom implicitly saying, hey kids, run to your uncle because your dad's a bit of a disaster. She still claims this was an honest mistake, but you see this blowback all the time. You see this particularly with salespeople or people who are focused too much on themselves, where you're inviting a Catholic to a steak restaurant on a Friday, you're inviting a Muslim to any meal during Ramadan, you're inviting a single parent to cocktail happy hour. It's all about us rather than them. And these are just sort of silly, and you'll have all experienced this. And the goal is, as we're negotiating influences, get out of our own skin, know who we are, and focus on the other party. This is not rifling through trash cans to find dirt on people. This is generating insight through being empathetic and doing so transparently. So if I was going to a meeting with Dan and we're focused on something around California, I'm going to want to be able to say to him, Dan, I spent as much time as possible researching you and your responsibilities so that I could understand, if I were you in your shoes, the things that are driving you and the things that are a pressure to you. And Dan should be complimented by that. He shouldn't feel cheated by it, so to speak. And if we don't do that, we see massive blowback. I was involved some years ago on a negotiation of a big sports sponsorship deal, and we were negotiating with UPS, and the chief operating officer of UPS was coming very close to signing this multi-million-dollar deal. And I was the person who FedExed him the proposal because we were so enthralled with myself. I was so enthralled with myself. So I'm now famous in the headquarters in Atlanta of asking for X million dollars while FedExing it. And so motivation is the thing that really drives almost every element of influence. If we're doing this correctly, then we will be successful in resonating with our audience. But to do that, we really need to be focused upon the things that are on this slide here, which we'll make available to you all. Okay, so once we've identified the motive of the person we're negotiating with, the next is to move from positions to interests. The work in this field was all led by this gentleman, Roger Fisher, who was the first academic to really study negotiation. He founded something called the Harvard Negotiation Project in the 1980s. We'll provide you a reading list of some of his and Bill Urey's work up at the Harvard Negotiation Project. But he really focused on this thing about moving from positions to interests. Now let's choose something that's really difficult to illustrate this. Gun ownership in the United States. You all represent 50 states for which there are very different views over gun ownership. But I dare say that many of your citizens view the ownership of guns as one of these two categories, liberty or violence. There are positions that people have about the right to bear arms, and it causes enormous heartbreak and tension in societal United States. And what's going on here is that we have two groups of people that are looking at the same data set but see things very differently. So for some people, owning a weapon in the United States is all about America. It's all about liberty and freedom and individuality. And for others, what they see is they see a lethal weapon. And both are correct. And it's the reason that we don't make any progress on this issue is because we're locked into positions over right and wrong. For me to be right, you have to be wrong. And these are all tied to issues around the Constitution and freedom and America and liberty and personal safety and children. And therefore we make, unsurprisingly, to people in my field, we make no progress on this issue whatsoever. But if we can move from our positions to our interests, and we stop talking about the right to bear arms, but we actually say, hey, is our common interest having children be safe in schools? Actually, we get almost universal agreement. We land in a place where we can all work on it together, and what's really important is we stop judging each other and we borrow from comedy improvisation skills, and instead of saying but, we say yes and we build on ideas to find solutions. You can probably see why I've chosen this example. COVID-19 is one of those things that is splitting our society, and we need to move away from positions of right and wrong and move to a position of what is our common interest in terms of restarting these economies and keeping as many people safe and healthy as possible. I purposely chose this tough subject because it's essentially saying we're using imperfect means for optimal ends. Or another translation is, you can be right or you can make progress. You get to choose. I can't emphasize that enough. Very rarely are we going to make progress on an issue if you are entirely proven right versus your counterpart because they are feeling flawed and weak and maybe cheated. It just doesn't make progress. So we're constantly focusing on your stakeholders' interests and your interests and how we find a mutual path forward. The final key is this idea of emotive framing, of how we frame the discussion. It's almost the most important thing is to focus on this before we even start trying to influence another party or reach a negotiated agreement. It's where you find this nonsensical phrase, the negotiators are negotiating about the negotiations. And it seems nonsensical, but actually it's really important. It's what is in frame and out of frame. One way to think about this is we frame art to tell you that's what we're talking about. Another way of framing is a simple agenda that says what the goal of the meeting is and what we're talking about. There's a lot of psychological work on this, and the leading researchers in this field were Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. They were the first non-economists to win the Nobel Prize for Economics. They're actually psychologists who started the field of behavioral economics, or were founding fathers of it. And they did all these groundbreaking studies around how, if you ask questions differently, you frame questions differently, you can lead to different answers. One of their flagship studies was with Harvard-trained physicians, where they asked these two questions. Would they go forward with a clinical procedure if the risk profiles were like this? Well, for those of you who are mathematically oriented, you know that the risk profile is exactly the same. But for Ivy League educated physicians, the way that a question was framed can lead to dramatically different results. And this whole field is around this idea of framing. So let's go back to that toughest of issues in the United States, which is a binary split around the rights of people to keep and bear arms. We have a choice. We can either lock in positions over this and argue over what the yes or no of whether we have the right, or we can reframe the question to accept the right and then focus on the word arms. And there is a common definition of arms. It's not debated. It's any device that can be used for defensive or offensive use. And by doing that, then we get to ask Americans, which of this range of arms are you in favor of Americans carrying? Because all of them fall in that category. And what we've suddenly done is we've taken a binary issue where it's yes or no and turned it into a spectrum, which is almost every issue in the United States that we're dealing with right now is presented to us as binary because of the way that algorithms work, but are actually spectrums. And so the onus on you all, as you go through this series, is to be thinking very hard about how do we reframe these issues for our citizens and for our politicians and for our civil servants, so that we can actually move these issues forward quickly and aggressively as we deal with these multiple crises at a time. I'm going to finish here, and we're wide open for questions at the end of this session at 3:30. The focus is to disenthrall ourselves from ourselves, know who we are, and find their motive. Choose progress over being right, focus on our interests over our positions, and create maximum resonance. Frame issues around the common interest and the motivation of the stakeholders you're dealing with, and you'll be able to move things forward.